Hello everyone, this is Abolfazl Meyarian. I'm a PhD student at the University of North Texas. Today I will be presenting our paper about ContourNet. In this paper we propose a deep convolutional neural network which is capable of differentiating contour levees from other irrigation practices. Uh, our network is capable of doing so using image gradients. It is also equipped with superpixel-based measure decoding as a post-processing phase in order to make the predictions inside the crop plans consistent. Moreover, use of deep supervision in the structure of our network helps it to enforce all of its layers to get involved in the production of final masks, uh, and it also helps it to get trained faster. In order to evaluate the performance of our network, we have tested it using nape imageries for Lonoke County. Here you can see the agenda of this presentation. We will first talk about the problem, the data, and the preparation steps that we take, and then we will dive into the proposed method specifications. And finally, we will talk about our experimental results. Well, let's talk about why classification of irrigation practices is important. We all know that we have different irrigation practices, such as contour levee, straight levee, or zero grade, but not all of them use the same amount of water. Preserving the water resources is an important task, and it could be done by finding out what type of irrigation practice is more common. For example, in this image, we can see different classes of them. Class C, F, A, and B represent contour levee, while E shows a non-agricultural land and probably the forests. D also shows another type of irrigation practices. So we will discuss what are the challenges in the next slide in this specific task. Now let's talk about the challenges that we have in classification of contour levees. One challenge is that in some cases the gaps between the levees are so small, while in some other samples they are so large. So the network should be able to understand the structure of the levees and whether the crop plan contains any levee or not in different situations with different settings. A sample of a small gap is shown in subfigure C and D, while a sample of very large gaps is shown in subfigure B. Another important factor is the visibility of the levees. For example, if the contrast of the background and the levees are so high, we can say that the levees are really easy visible. For example, what is shown in subfigure B is an indicator of this fact. And on the other hand, it could be very similar to the background and leads to a poor visibility factor for the levees, as shown in subfigure F. Another challenge is also distinguishing the features of the lines which represent the levees. For example, straight levees are straight parallel lines, while the contour levees are curved lines. So distinguishing these two from each other is really crucial. And another important side of the problem is regarding distinguishing the levees from other types of lines, for example, roller lines or roads, which also exist in the samples. So the main tasks are to address these problems with a given proposed method. To tell you more about the data preparation steps, I should say that the images were acquired by the NAPE program in 2015. And we are using those samples from the Lonoke County. For each sample, we have an image of a size 5,000 by 5,000, and those samples contain a lot of contoured or probably zero and straight levees. These samples are annotated in a way that for each cropland that contains a specific irrigation practice, we create a polygon and then we assign a label to that polygon, which is further interpreted to an image and is used for training the network. In this whole procedure, we use a CDL map to have a consistent information about what croplands are actually used for cultivation of rice product. Well, the sampling method is an important factor when we are dealing with a very high resolution image of a very large dimension, as is the case here, because the images have a dimension of 5000 by 5000. So it is necessary to have a model being trained on just small patches of this large image. In order to do the sampling, we want to use superpixels. Why do we use superpixels? Well, there is a clear answer, because we want to take the samples from the inside of the croplands. In that way, the possibility of having other lines, other type of lines, but levees, is reduced in a way that the border lines and the rows are not captured inside the samples, and that lets the network to get more used to the levees and then to know them better. So for this purpose, we use Foldenwald method to produce those superpixels. Superpixels basically tell us what group of pixels are more similar, and then using that we can have the boundaries of a cropland identified easily, as all of the pixels of a specific cropland are considered as just one group. This technique is further also used for the post-processing, which I will mention later in the next slides. Well, now let's talk about why we use image gradients instead of RGB images. One important fact about the contour levees is that contour levees may appear with different colors, different textures, but they all have levees in them. Levees are usually represented as curved lines, and detecting these curved lines helps us to know whether we have a contour levee or not. So we use a type of data that just cares about the lines. Basically, a line is created when there is a intense change in the intensity of the pixel colors. Image gradients provide this information for us. If we use image gradients, we can be sure that if the color or the texture of the croplands changes, for example, from this sample to another sample, or from sample of this state or county to another state or county, our model does not lose its performance. So it also helps the model to be very generalized. And that is why we have chosen to use image gradients for the main source of information for our model to classify them. This slide is dedicated to showing you the structure of our network. Our network consists of two parts, encoder and decoder. The encoder generates the deep features from the gradient images, and then the decoder retrieves the desired masks from those deep features. The decoder has skip connections coming from the encoder in order to facilitate its training and also pass useful low-level features from the encoder to the decoder. We also have 4 stages of mask generation, in which each mask is generated from the convolutional features of the main stream of the decoder. After a mask is generated, we pass it forward to use it as a history for generation of the further masks. And finally, all of these generated masks, namely mask 1, mask 2.2, mask 3.2, and mask 4.2, are penalized through the comparison of these masks with the ground truth. And this mechanism is basically called deep supervision. Now, let's talk about the cost function that we use to train our network. It has 2 main parts. One is about the segmentation cost, and the other one is about the regularization cost. Segmentation cost is basically 4 components of cross entropy that compare each mask with the ground truth. Those components are equally weighted to 1 and summed together to form the cost function C. The weights assigned to each of these components are set empirically based on the results that we got by training network with different settings. And also the regularization cost lets the network to not basically overfit on the data samples by adding the L2 norm of the parameters to the cost function. And it also has a weight which is set to be 0.00001. Now it's time to talk about the post-processing method that we use to refine the predictions achieved by our proposed model. The main assumption here is that pixels of the same cropland cannot have different labels. The entire cropland basically uses the same irrigation practice. So we can use this assumption to perform a majority voting based on the labels identified by the model. It is done in a way that, given a sample image, we first take the image and feed it to a superpixel segmentation method. In our case, we use false-envelope superpixel segmentation, which is a graph-based technique. And then when the boundaries are ready, we can perform a majority voting of the pixels pixel labels inside that cropland, and then assign the label with the highest frequency to the whole cropland. In that way, the false negatives and true negatives probably are removed from this cropland. The result is shown in figure raw prediction and refined prediction, which shows how much of those small noisy portions of the predictions are removed after the refinement. Now let's talk about the setting that we used for the training and testing of the models. In our dataset, we had 16 tiles of 5,000 by 5,000 images. Each time we used one sample for testing and the rest of them for the training. Those using the training are actually augmented through rotation. This schema is called k-fold cross-validation, and the k here is 16. The table in the middle of this slide shows the results of evaluations on 16 tiles of the Lono County. In all of the cases, our model gradient contour net performs the best, and also RGB version of our network performs better than the other existing models. Using the images with the original size of 5,000 by 5,000 for generation of superpixels is not something reasonable, because in that way many small regions in the image could be considered as a separate superpixel. So we use scaling before we generate those superpixels from the images. This scaling is to a size less than 5,000 by 5,000. So we tested 400 by 400, 500 by 500, and finally 1,000 by 1,000. In general, based on the results, we got the best accuracies with the size of 500 by 500, and that is the size that we use in our evaluations. In this slide, you can see a comparison of our method with other existing methods with respect to challenging cases. There are 4 main challenging cases in the input image A, shown in blue, yellow, red, and orange colors. The blue one is where we have very large gaps between the levees. The yellow one shows the dense layout of levees in a cropland, and also in the red one we can see a very low visibility factor of the levees. The orange one on the top also shows a zero-grade irrigation system. Almost for all of them, random forest fails to identify the correct labels with a high accuracy. And we can see that in the yellow box in the middle, the random forest does not provide any correct label for the levees themselves. And this shows, well, the random forest does not care about the levees. It's just judging based on the colors. And having this type of attitude for making the predictions leads to a very poor performance identifying the background labels for the orange polygon in the image. And as you can see, we have a lot of contour Levee labeled pixels in that area, while it should be totally background. And for the region next to it, we can also see that the whole region is classified as contour Levee, while that one is also zero grade system. We have the same issue in FCN ATR skip. We can see that the low visibility factor in the red box affects its performance highly, and then it is not also able to handle large gaps between the levees in the blue polygon, and in some regions of the yellow polygon where the density is increased, we have many misclassifications. However, gradient network takes care of all these cases correctly and has a higher performance compared to the other existing models. RGB network is not as good as gradient network, but it also performs better than the other two existing models. In refinement of predictions using the superpixels, it is more probable to improve the results if we use superpixels of a reasonable number of pixels with a regular shape. So we can rank them based on their geometry. For the ranking, we have created a score that has two main parts. The score, which is also referred to here as D of I, in which I is the image, or the image of the superpixel itself, to be more accurate. We have two main components, which is N, the number of pixels, and E, the elongation. The elongation factor is calculated using the first three formula here, and the number of pixels basically is just obtained using a masking with the superpixel boundaries that we have. So if a superpixel has a higher number of pixels and a lower level of elongation, it receives a higher score. On the other hand, if it is too elongated or has a few pixels, it receives a lower score. On the top of this slide, you can see a heat map of the scoring for a sample image. And finally, the conclusion of this presentation. In this work, we presented a novel deep convolutional neural network for irrigation practice mapping. We used image gradients as the main source of information for a network to train it. This helps the model to obtain a better generalization, while better results also on identification of croplands with contour levees. Our model had an improvement of 5.42% accuracy and 44% in terms of BER compared to the second best model among all these models that we tested against. And finally, our model was capable of handling all of the challenging cases in this area, namely those with low level of visibility, those with a varying space between the levees, and those with a high contrast in terms of the color of the background and the contour levees. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, you can always ask us. I've provided the email in the very last slide. Thank you so much.